The 3D channel effect that you will probably use the most often is the depth of field effect. Depth of field is basically kind of like a camera trick where you change the lens so that different objects are blurry. And you can basically do this so that you cause focus to be at a certain part in your scene. So let's say that maybe somebody was in this garage and we wanted to show them just kind of tinkering around on a car. Then what we basically do is kind of blur this background, use depth of field in the camera to blur the background while somebody's like working here. And then let's say we wanted to have that person be like stalked or something like that. So then what we could do is blur the foreground and bring the background and make that clear using depth of field again. So basically we're using blur and focus to determine where our viewers' eyes go quickly and go first. For whatever reason, your eyes just naturally gravitate towards areas that are the most sharp and the most clear. They tend to ignore quickly areas that are blurry. Now, I realize that you can do stuff like this with blur, but there are some differences as we'll see. So I have this depth of field project. I'm going to apply the depth of field effect from the 3D channel effects area. When you first apply it, it doesn't do anything. As a matter of fact, this effect is a little tricky. Give us a little bit more room here so we definitely can see what's going on. We have the focal plane. But before we start adjusting stuff, it's a good idea to play with these other settings first, maximum radius and focal plane thickness. Now, maximum radius is the blur. So if we take this to a very small amount like 2, you can see that that adds a significant amount of blur. As a matter of fact, from my experience with this effect, a little bit goes a long way. So you want to just go a little bit here and there, other than the focal plane, which goes into the tens of thousands if your scene is big enough. But as far as the blur and some other settings, you want to basically walk on eggshells. Be really careful there. Now, the focal plane thickness is probably one of the most important parts of this whole thing. In order to make anything else work, you got to have the right setting for that parameter. The way to figure this out from my experience is to basically add up the total dimensions from the very beginning of your scene to the very end of your scene. And like the other 3D effects, we can do that by activating the effect here in the Effect Controls panel and then clicking while looking at the info panel. So we know that this corner of our table is probably the foremost object. That's at -89. And we click very back in the background here, and that's -4130. So it's a difference of about 4,000. I'm just going to go ahead and round up and say 5,000 here. So basically we've told depth of field that that's how big the world is that you're working in. And we can adjust the focal plane parameter to determine where the focal plane line is. So now as we come up here a little bit, actually it's a little bit too much, we're blurring our foreground elements. But basically what we've done here is we've blurred these background areas and left the foreground areas sharp and clean. I suppose we could have done the same thing with masks, but the advantage here is that you can actually animate the focal plane. So remember the scenario I was talking about in the beginning where we had the mechanic in focus and the background blurry, and then we wanted to show this stalker behind him in the back, so he gets blurry and the person back here gets sharp. Well, we'd have to animate that in order to make that look believable, and you can't really do that with blur. You can't animate through masks, as it were. One other setting I'm going to change is the focal bias. Taking down the focal bias makes it so that it's not so hair triggery. When you move the focal plane, sometimes it's really hard to get like the exact setting. Sometimes, like such as in this case, we've managed to blur the background the way we want it, but now the car's blurry. And if we take that down a little bit, it's still a little bit blurry. It's kind of hard to get exactly the way you want it. So I'm going to take down focal bias to like 6, and that will allow the focal plane to be more precise. So we can go in and we can blur elements. So basically like this, where we have the car clear and then we have kind of like the car in the back and especially the background being very blurry. But we could also do the reverse. If we take this focal plane number into the negatives, let's take this to maybe like -6,300 or so. Ooh, that's a little bit too much. And that's still a little bit too much. See, what we've done here is we've slightly blurred the foreground and kept the background sharp. When the viewer sees this, their eye will naturally jump to this background. So even though there's all this other stuff right in their face, their eyes will jump to the back of the scene. And that's telling a good story when you're making a movie. Being able to put your viewer in your scene and make them focus and look at and care about what you want them to look at and focus on and care about. And that's depth of field.